Hi, friends. This is Emily. I am the owner and founder of Friendly City Books in Columbus, Mississippi. And today I'm excited to be joined on the podcast by author Gerry Wilson of That Pinson Girl. Hi, Gerry.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. We wanted to have her do a podcast episode with us ahead of her upcoming appearance in Columbus. Gerry is going to come do a book talk for us, a lunch and learn at the Columbus Lowndes Public Library at the main branch in Columbus with our friend Ellen Ann Fentress, who is the author of The Steps We Take. Many of our locals know her well already, as Ellen Ann teaches in the creative writing MFA program at Mississippi University for Women in our hometown of the Friendly City. And so they will be joining us on Monday, March 11th at noon at the library. But this is a special sneak peek. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to try not to give away any spoilers. But I think that everyone is going to enjoy reading this book. It's a historical fiction novel set in Mississippi in the early 20th century in rural Northeast Mississippi, in parts very similar to this area. And I want to give a little bit of background about Gerry and read you her bio. We'll have Gerry tell us, what isn't in this 100-word bio about her life and her writing career. And then we'll talk about the book. So this is Gerry's bio. A seventh-generation Mississippian and a child of the hill country she writes about in That Pinson Girl, Gerry came of age during the turbulent civil rights era. Her story collection, Crosscurrents and Other Stories, was nominated for the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Fiction Award. I have a feeling this one will be as well. Gerry is a recipient of a Mississippi Arts Commission Literary Arts Fellowship, and her stories have appeared in numerous journals. That Pinson Girl is her first novel. So, Gerry, tell us more about who you are and your life.
Oh, I could tell you a lot more, but I'll try to keep it brief. It is true that I was born and I grew up in the hills of North Mississippi. I will share with you that I have a vivid memory of when Intruder in the Dust was filmed in Oxford, and that would have been about 1948 or 49.
No kidding.
Yes, and I didn't go to see the filming, but there was a lot of talk about it. Pontotoc is sort of halfway between Oxford and Tupelo.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes think of my little hometown, Pontotoc, as the place in between, because I wonder, if the university had located there, or if the medical centers and the industries had located there, then it might have been a very different place. But anyway, I do remember that distinctly, and I remember how people talked about the filming, and people flocked to Oxford to watch the filming on the square, and they would watch the dailies in the old Lyric Theater. But most people had great disdain for William Faulkner. He was Count No Count. And I remember hearing that phrase. And of course, it was much, much later that I discovered who he really was as an author.
Was this before or after he won the Nobel Prize? Wasn't that in maybe the early 60s?
Yes, I think the Nobel was later.
Yeah.
The Nobel was later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he didn't have that credential yet, and he was just...
He didn't have that credential yet, and he was, people called him uppity. But what the point I'm headed toward in sort of a roundabout way is that phrase of his that he talked about, my postage stamp of native soil.
Yes.
And I feel that way about the hills of North Mississippi, even though I've been gone for so many years. It is the place that birthed me and grounded me. And I think it's a place that leaves its mark on us if we're fortunate enough to come from there. The other thing I'll mention that is not in the bio is that I taught creative writing for many years. After my children were all old enough to be in school, I got a teacher's license and did the dutiful thing and went to work as an English teacher. And I discovered along the way that I didn't like the way students were being taught to write. They were being taught to write 5-paragraph essays, first 3-paragraph essays, and then 5-paragraph essays. And granted, that was a method that helped them learn to organize their thoughts, to organize their material, but they had no voice. They wrote these cookie cutter essays with introduction, point 1, point 2, point 3, closure that repeats the introduction. And so I proposed to my school's administration that they let me have a creative writing class and let me teach creative writing. And then when they gave it to me, I had to figure out how to do that. And so I started going to some workshops and learning along with the students, basically. But that's when I began to write fiction. So I sort of learned along with them. Yeah.
Well, neat. Oh, that's such an interesting way to get into writing, starting as an educator. And some of our favorite writers at the bookstore are also educators. So I'm not surprised to learn that you had that background. So you were born in Pontotoc and you live in Jackson now, is that correct?
Yes, since the early 60s.
Since the early 60s. Okay. Well, we love Jackson. We go to the Mississippi Book Festival every year since we started our bookstore. And we are great friends with Lemuria Books down there. And it's great to know that you've become such a strong part of the Jackson and the Mississippi writing community. Given that your book is set in Northeast Mississippi, there was one little Easter egg I couldn't help but share for our local listeners. So early in the book, this is actually on page 42, Leona, our main character, is going on a date, and her date is on the Tombigbee River. So I just want to read this short little sentence because it just felt very close to home. That day, she told her aunt she was going to Birdie's to see some young people from town, but she went to Hawks Creek and waited for Walker. He took her to his family's fishing cabin on the Tombigbee River. Walker has brought his box camera. He showed Leona how it folded shut and how the wooden spool of film fit inside. He took pictures of her by the river. He gave her a bag of chocolate candy she would hide in her room later that day and eat one at a time, closing her eyes and savoring the chocolate more because it reminded her of him. And what I love about this passage is not only the reference to the Tombigbee River, but also the reference to this to photography during this particular point in time. Because we have this wonderful book at the bookstore and just held a book event with Berkeley Hudson, who has worked on the archive of photographs of the Columbus area by Owen Pruitt, who was working in our area from 1920 to 1960. And your book takes place just before this and almost like overlaps a little bit. So it was so interesting to hear this description because we had an exhibit of the work and they actually brought in his box camera.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the the fun historical tidbits that you discovered or researched in writing a historical novel that was set in 1918 in rural Mississippi?
Well, there was a lot because I wanted to be sure to support the story with details that felt right, that felt realistic, without calling too much attention to them. In my mind, there's nothing worse than running across an anachronism where something leaps off the page as being completely out of sync with the story and with the time frame. One that I remember was trying to figure out, there's a point in the story where Leona goes into the store to buy a trinket for her little boy who's turning 1. And I had to try to figure out how much might be a reasonable price for her to pay for a little tiny tin truck. So it's interesting, to think about what kind of stove they might have had in the kitchen. I didn't need to know a brand. I didn't need to know too much about that, but I needed to know enough to make it seem realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I did a good bit of research about the war, World War One. I needed to know what the draft was like, how that was structured, when young men and boys were called up, where they might go for training.
Mm-hmm.
All of that needed to be relevant. And then I wanted to place Leona's lover, the father of her child, in the trenches in France. And in order to do that, I wanted to read about trench warfare and what that was like. I mean, I had the impression of how awful it was, but I needed more of that. I needed the stench and the sound and the mud and the fear.
Yeah, like when you describe like his feet, starting to, rot or like get
Yeah,
gangrene,
yeah,
from wearing wet boots day in and day out. I remember that being like a detail that was so vivid that, kind of makes you shiver.
yeah. So there was a great deal of research, and I will say that research is so much easier these days than it used to be. Because there are reliable sources online. You just have to be careful that what you're using is reliable. But I was able to take advantage of that.
Can I ask you another question
Sure.
on this research and the setting and time? This is also set during the influenza outbreak
Yeah.
of 1918. And I mean, did you write this before or after COVID? I have to ask.
I actually wrote it before.
You're kidding.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, it was always the flu epidemic of 1918, 1919 had to be a part of the story, it seemed to me, if I was going to set the story during that time period. So yeah, it was written before, but I think I pulled this book out. I started this book about 10 or 12 years ago, actually. I
Okay.
got a strong beginning, but I just polished that beginning to no end and couldn't get much beyond that. And so excuse me, I worked on it periodically and I'd put it away. And I'd pull it out and I'd work on it again and I'd put it away. And so I think it was maybe during the summer of 2021 that it just kept nagging at me. And maybe it's because of COVID that it did. So I went back to it and I was able to do some really good work on it, that last revision. And so I think what COVID did is that it increased my awareness. It made the flu epidemic seem so much more real to me. It made the fear and the details of the sickness and all that just more relevant to the novel.
One thing that really struck me in the portion of the book that when the epidemic starts going around North Mississippi is that Leona goes by her friend's house and ends up getting kind of waylaid there for several weeks trying to help her friend's family
She's
through.
trapped.
Yeah, she's kind of trapped. And I mean, that's kind of how, when with COVID in, the middle of March of 2020, we all kind of were caught unaware and we're stuck. I mean, so like I was actually going to buy my house in Columbus and the closing got postponed. So my parents said, well, come stay with us for the weekend until you rescheduled it. And I ended up staying with them for 6 months. So
yeah.
it was just funny to me reading it. I was like, wow, how'd she get stuck there? And I was like, wait a minute. We all got stuck there.
Well, she dared not go home because there had been talk of the flu. There had been talk about it, but I think Bertie is the one who tells her that, oh, my pa says, he's heard there's flu around, but we don't need to worry about it. It's so far away. Well, of course, what happens in the book is that a circus comes to town, and by the time the circus leaves, after the circus leaves, people start to get sick.
Yeah.
Which actually, there's a story. I don't know if you're aware that there's a little story about that that I wish I could pinpoint the source where I found it, but there's a story that's actually how the flu began in Northeast Mississippi. Is that there was a traveling show or traveling circus that actually brought the flu to whatever little town it was, and that's how. So that's where the idea for the circus spreading the flu came from.
No kidding. Well,
Yeah.
it's ironic because one of my memories of Berkeley's book of the photographs he collected from Owen Pruitt, one of them is about a traveling act that comes through, and I can't remember the dates, and it wasn't flu related, but this was the entertainment for everybody. There wasn't television. There would be these traveling troops that came through of all different types, and so there was a traveling act that was buried alive, and then there was like a fortune teller. And then the boxer Jack Dempsey was part of this group, making us early celebrity sighting. And part of this traveling group were Truman Capote's parents. And Truman Capote's mom had an affair with Jack Dempsey on this trip. And he later wrote a story about it with Harper Lee. They wrote it together, and it was in Harper's Magazine, I want to say. If I'm remembering correctly, and it's based on it's kind of a fictionalization of his mother's affair with Jack Dempsey.
Oh, that's a good story. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's just a little aside, but I do want to go back to talking about your book, and we've alluded to some of the main characters, but could you just give us a summary of the main cast of characters surrounding our protagonist, Leona, and her family and the others in her community?
Sure. Well, I'll start just briefly with Leona. Leona, as you said, is the main character, and Leona gives birth to a child out of wedlock when she's only 17 years old, which of course isolates her. She's ostracized in the community. She's an embarrassment to her family, which was true in those days, certainly. Leona has only gone through the 8th grade. She lives way out in the country, and she's gone to a one-room school, and that's as far as she's able to go. But I like to think that Leona is very resourceful. One of the things I struggled with Leona was that she could have been, and she was in some ways, such a powerless character because so many other people had control over her life. And so my goal was to make her stronger and help her grow beyond that. And she doesn't get a whole lot of help with that in the novel. The next character I would talk about probably is Luther Biggs, who is a biracial sharecropper, whose connections to the Pinson family go way back. And even though Luther is not enslaved, we're talking early 20th century, Luther's ties to the family are so deep and so complicated that he has stayed. And so that becomes one of the subplots in the novel. But Luther loves Leona and cares for her and is very protective of her. So Luther may be my favorite character of all.
You definitely, it's hard not to love him. I mean, he's you really root for him, and I feel like you go along in on the ride with him, where you're rooting for him to be able to keep moving his life forward, and then when circumstances bring affect him and his family, you also are on that emotional roller coaster with him. And his story, I think, could be the story for many, many Mississippians who came of age in the same time period. And so when I read his story, it's almost not like you're reading the story of a character in a novel. It is a stand-in for many people who really did live during this time and were in his shoes.
Mm. Good. I'm glad to hear that.
All right. So we talked about Leona and Luther and how much we love them and how much we're rooting for them. But there's a character who I also really hated, or you could say I love to hate this character, and that's Leona's brother, Raymond. Can you tell us about him and his backstory?
Sure. Emily already told me before we began that she had these strong feelings about Raymond. And I asked her if she could find a soft spot for Raymond somewhere, because I worked really hard. Raymond is a dastardly kind of character, but I wanted him to have some vulnerability. He's had a really difficult relationship with his father. He's always wanted his father's approval, and he's never felt that he had it, even though there's nothing on the surface of their relationship, at least to suggest that, to suggest otherwise. But Raymond just seems to have things go against Raymond at every turn in his mind. His parents love his younger sister Leona more than they love him. He would love to go to the war and fight in France, and the army won't take him because he's the only male left to run the farm, and so he feels all left out by the war. He rides with a group of young men who model themselves on the old Ku Klux Klan and go around the neighborhood terrorizing people, primarily Black folks. And so there's not a lot to recommend Raymond, I guess, and yet I hope he's at least complicated enough that he seems real.
Definitely. I mean, all of your characters feel very real because, I mean, you see in Raymond that he's got a lot of pain. He's hurt and he's lashing out because he doesn't know what to do with it. You know, he doesn't have a constructive outlet for these feelings. Actually, I thought a lot about, we were having this modern conversation on toxic masculinity. And as I was reading Raymond's character, I was like, oh, he could really benefit from this discussion. But, you know, also by the same turn, so Raymond feels like he doesn't have his dad's, that his dad doesn't love him as much as he loves his sister. Leona feels like her mother doesn't love her as much as she loves her brother.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of this unusual sibling rivalry, and where they're each seeking, their parents' approval and favor.
Right. That's true. And in the case of Leona's mother, her relationship with Raymond and her different relationship with Leona have to do with her own deep-seated secret that she carries, that she's burdened with. And so that's an important part of the story, too.
Yeah, there are a lot of secrets in this book, now that you mention it. And I see why there's a quotation on the front from author Tiffany Quay Tyson. She says, "A beautiful novel about the destructive power of dark secrets." And there are a lot of secrets in this family, in this town. There are also things that are actually evident, but that people don't want to acknowledge. So there's both like real actual secrets that nobody knows, but also these open secrets that everyone knows and won't acknowledge. Is that like a small town thing?
I think it's a human thing.
Yeah.
It may be, but small towns are famous for intricate ties, and yeah, so maybe so.
Yeah. Um, what other should we also talk about? I do like Leona's best friend, Bertie, and I'm glad that she has a friend because at times it can feel like things could be very lonely for Leona because she's got these family problems. And so I feel a relief for her that she's got this great friendship.
Yeah, I think Bertie is essential to the novel. Bertie is Leona's age, and they've grown up in this rural neighborhood together. Um, and Bertie has remained a friend to the point of slipping out of her house to go and see Leona when Leona, after the news gets out that Leona is pregnant with this child. And Bertie's father has forbidden her to have anything to do with Leona, but Bertie continues the friendship and supports Leona through all that. And then in turn, Leona is the person that Bertie goes to when all of her family starts to get sick with the influenza.
Yeah.
Bertie goes to Leona and asks her to come, and they don't know it that that's what it is. But it turns out that the flu epidemic has reached rural North Mississippi at that point.
Yeah. How much should we talk about the next character, Walker? What do you want the audience to know? Let's assume they haven't read the book yet. So how much do you want to tell?
Well, Walker Broom is the town boy. I could put air quotes around that Leona sort of falls for. He pays her some attention. He um, meets her on the square in town one day and offers to take her for a ride in his car, which just seems like a remarkable thing to Leona because her family doesn't have an automobile and probably never will. And so that's sort of the start of their relationship. But Walker is a little bit older. He's 4 years older. He has finished high school. He's gone to work in his father's store, mercantile store in town. And so Walker is not a worldly person, but in terms of the smallness of Leona's world, he's a step beyond anything she can imagine. And so she begins this connection with him. Walker goes off to the war without knowing that Leona is pregnant with his child. And so the complications just pile on after that. And they lose touch. Walker writes letters and can't bring himself to send them. His letters go into the bottom of a trunk. Leona doesn't know how to get in touch with Walker. It's beyond her imagining. And so they are star-crossed lovers in the best sense of the word, I guess, in that things go against them rather than for them. And
Yeah.
ultimately Walker, go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, given the time period that this is set in, it may be hard for modern readers with our, cell phones and ability to text message and find, Facebook, find people. We may not realize that in 1918, I mean, Leona got information by literally walking to that person's house or into town to deliver a message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and letters would have been important. Do we have time for me to tell a little family
Yes.
story of my own about letters and the importance of letters?
Yes, please tell us your story.
My maternal granddaddy went off to fight in World War One, and apparently on their way to ship out for France, these boys, as we call them, spent a little bit of time in New York City. In the spring of 1919, this letter arrives back in Springville, Mississippi, which was just a post office out in Pontotoc County, addressed to my granddaddy. The letter had gone from New York all the way to France through several APO connections and all the way back to Mississippi. It was written by a young woman who was a New Yorker. She lived in New York, and she wrote the letter on the day the armistice was declared. And she's describing the celebrations in the streets over the peace settlement. And that letter she sent to him went all the way to France and all the way back home, and it arrived about a month after he married my grandmother. And it's just, I have the letter. It's about, I'd say it's about 2.5 by 4 inches. It's tiny. And when you think about in those days how that little letter, how fragile it was, but how it managed to make that trip halfway across the world and back, is just the most remarkable thing. So I think that's why letters, or the absence of letters, became so important for me in telling the story. I cherish that little letter.
I'm so glad you shared that. A friend of mine who is an archivist at the W is actually working on a huge project digitizing a family's letters from, they are from your part of North Mississippi. Why am I'm blanking on the name of the town. But, that letter is invaluable. So I'm glad to hear that you've saved it. And if you want to, bring it to our event, because I know some local historians who would love to see it.
I will.
Please do.
Yeah, I'll try to remember to do that. Sure.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the news of Armistice Day, in the book, it's because they don't have, television or, even radio at that point, at least not in their homes. When the news that the war is over starts getting around, the characters almost don't believe it because they have no way to verify it except finding out that there was a celebration in town. And so they're like, well, it must have really happened then. And so that's another thing that is almost foreign to imagine now with how quickly news travels. Leona is also faced with an incredible amount of sexism. And I'm sure that she would not have known to call it that in her time. But, reading it with a modern eye, you just see how much of it at a disadvantage she is purely for being a woman. And of course, the big thing is that she becomes pregnant with an illegitimate child after her second date with this guy. And nobody knows who he is. It's her fault. Doesn't matter who he is. It's her fault that she got pregnant. And anyway, what were you trying to express through these barriers that Leona is facing?
I think I was trying to express those same barriers are around now. I could see that more and more as I wrote Leona's character, particularly. As I said earlier, I had to work really hard to take her out of a mode of helplessness and dependency on particularly the males around her. Her father's gone. Raymond doesn't care for her. Luther does, but Luther's not in a position to do much in terms of taking care of her. But it struck me as I went deeper and deeper into Leona that those are the roots. Those are the roots of the kind of sexism and discrimination against women that we still see today. I wouldn't have called it that when I was growing up, and even, into my teenage years, and even after I married and I was a young stay-at-home mom. I remember one of the things that my dad encouraged me to do was to take some education courses and get a teacher's license in case, and I put that in air quotes again, I ever needed to work. the expectation was that I would marry well, and I would marry somebody who would take care of me, and I would bear children, and I would live the life of a good wife and a good mother. And I did that to some extent, but I was 50. I'll put it this way. I don't regret those early roles. I can't possibly regret those roles because I have my sons to show for that. But I was 50 before I really started to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so that's my title, Leona, I think, right there.
Yes, because, Leona loves being a mother. She loves her son, and she would not change that. What I do wish I could change for her is the power dynamic between her and her brother, because her brother can get away with anything. And even, there's a story in here about when they're children, and he pushed her off the porch and she broke her arm. And he said, don't tell mom and dad, don't tell her mom and her daddy that I pushed you, or I'll break your other arm. So when her parents see that she has a broken arm, they say, what happened? And she has to say, I fell. And then she's yelled at for playing on the porch when she's not supposed to. And that's just, the tip of the iceberg. This is just when they're kids. The stakes become higher and higher and higher as they get older. And as Raymond is continually able to take advantage of his position as the older brother, to the point where it's extremely abusive. And that's, kind of what I think about with, the issues of sexism in this book is the power differential. And that also brings me to the issues of racism in the book too, because Raymond also likes to lord the power and control he has over Luther and Luther's son Jesse, purely because they are Black and because he is a white man. And we recently had an event, a book event with Grace Elizabeth Hale. Her new book, In the Pines, is also set in Mississippi. It's nonfiction, but bears a lot of resemblance to what happens in your book. And she described the definition, and I'm not going to quote this perfectly, but the definition of privilege as being able to not only define and control other people's freedom and autonomy and space and where they can go and what they can do, but also being able to cross the lines that you have set for others. And Raymond does that at every opportunity. So this is another reason why I don't like Raymond. But I was telling Gerry that there's a scene in her novel that comes as almost word for word what happens in Grace's book, that she's describing a historical event that her family was involved in, involving the lynching of a Black man. Her book is set in the 50s, so about a generation after Gerry's novel. But we can't talk about a book set in Mississippi without talking about race.
Yeah. And that was also a struggle for me in writing the book. There are people who would say that because I'm an older white woman, I have no right to try to create a character of another race, because I have not experienced that, and therefore I shouldn't try to recreate it. But I felt it was important, so I decided to set the story in this time frame. It felt really important. I mean, how could you write a story set in rural Mississippi or rural just about anywhere in the South during that time period and ignore the race dynamics. I just don't think it's possible.
I think it would be worse not to.
Not to. And sure, I probably didn't always get it right, but I tried to tell it by my best lights. I relied on family stories, family myth. My maternal grandmother, to whom this book is dedicated, was a wonderful storyteller. And she was one tough cookie. She lived an extremely hard life. She only went through the 8th grade. So in some ways, Leona is modeled on her. And Mama, my grandmother, will have to forgive me for sharing that because she was always embarrassed by her lack of education. But, I had the family stories. I had the local myths to go on. And we are talking about fiction, and I think the best we can do in fiction is create a world that is believable. And so it was really important to me to try to portray those dynamics as best I could. And there is no saint. He has his flaws. It's not that I'm trying to glorify Luther in any way. But the relationships are just extremely, extremely complicated. And I think that's true of life then and now. And so that was my goal, really.
Absolutely. Yes, there are never any easy answers. People are not one-dimensional. There are many angles to every story, and I think that you're right that fiction has to show all of those contradictions in order to be realistic. You alluded to when we were talking about Raymond, the fact that his character is involved in a group that is effectively the Ku Klux Klan of their town. They get in hoods, they've burned down people's property and threatened them and use it to be bullies and use it to be like vigilantes outside the law. So I think that's also a really important aspect of the book to mention, because you can't tell a story set in America at this, during the Jim Crow era without recognizing that this was the reality for a lot of people living through this era of racial terror.
I totally agree. Obviously, I agree because it's such an important part of the book. And those people were real. I think I've been sitting here and the image of that, the black tablets, the monuments in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum with the lists of the names of all the people who were lynched is such a stunning display. It just, first time I saw it, it just left a mark on me. Because I looked at the first tablet, this black, shiny stone, taller than I am. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's so striking. And then I walked a few steps and I saw there was another column behind it, and another monument behind that one, and another monument behind that one. And that's our heritage. That's our heritage still. And so it's important to acknowledge that as we can, even in fiction. And even if I'm limited in my means of telling those stories, because I was not there, I didn't have those experiences myself.
I will say what I've always found most powerful about fiction is the ability to find universal truths in stories that might be idiosyncratic or very specific to a time and place, when you can draw the parallels to real life or your own life, whether you are from that place or not, is I think what makes storytelling so powerful.
Yeah, I think the best historical fiction has to resonate with something it has to make a connection with who we are and where we are now. I love Geraldine Brooks's historical fiction because she does such a good job of connecting the historical story with the context and the issues of our own time. She's very good at that. I just read her most recent book, Horse, that's about it's set in two time frames. It has a contemporary time frame, and an historical time frame. The historical time frame follows this remarkable racehorse in a racing culture of around the time of the Civil War. And in the modern time frame, the main character is on the trail. She's trying to track down the history of a painting of that horse. And so the two stories obviously get intertwined. But I so admire her ability to take a historical story and make it relevant to readers today.
Yeah, there are two other examples that I can't help but compare your book and your writing to. One is the writer Marilynne Robinson.
Oh my goodness. I bow down to that. Yeah. She's remarkable.
The way that you portray rural, sorry, I'm not pronouncing this properly. The way that you portray rural life and the interior lives of rural women, I think, gave me that kind of Marilynne Robinson feeling. And the other book that I think your book is almost talking to, in a sense, is a book called The Girls in the Stilt House that came out a couple of years ago by Kelly Mustian. We had a virtual event with her when her book came out because it was during COVID, and we had just opened our bookstore. And I thought your books are similar in the best ways. And so anyone who's listening who read that book because we recommended it at Friendly City Books will enjoy That Pinson Girl as well.
I love that book as well. When you're pitching a novel to an agent or to a publisher, you almost always have to come up with what they call comps, stories that are comparable to yours, but it's tricky because if the comps are too much like your book, that's not good. And if they're too different from your book, that's not good either. But I stumbled across The Girls in the Stilt House when I was searching for comps and read it and just loved it. Yeah, that's a really nice book. Just thank you for that.
Well, I'm so glad you thought of the same book in this conversation because we loved it, and it continues to be one of our best-selling books at the bookstore. So I hope to see That Pinson Girl join its ranks and be one of our bestsellers. We have a Mississippi section at the bookstore where we have all of our Mississippi writers, fiction and nonfiction, all in one wall. So when you come to the bookstore, you'll be able to see it and see your book near it. Since your name is Gerry Wilson with a W, you'll actually be close to, just a few people like Jesmyn Ward, Tennessee Williams.
Actually, the book was featured in a bookseller review newsletter or something like that, right next to Jesmyn Ward, and so I took a screenshot of that and used it in some of my promo materials. Yeah.
Well, we can't wait to welcome you to Columbus and to have you
I'm
at Friendly
so
City
looking
Books.
forward to it. Yeah.
And to have you at the public library. And just as a reminder for our local listeners, Gerry will be appearing at the Columbus Lowndes Public Library on Monday, March 11th at noon for a lunch and book talk with Ellen Ann Fentress. And we will have copies of her book there for sale. So, Gerry, I'd really like to thank you for the time you've spent with us today. You've been very generous.
Oh, thank you, Emily. I so appreciate it. It's been great fun.
Thank you.
I love to talk books.
Anytime. So thank you for coming on our podcast to do just that and talk books with us. And to everyone listening, I'd like to say happy reading.